Good morning. My name is Jennifer Turner. I'd like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I direct the China Environment Forum. I've been here for 23 years. And in that time, I do a lot on US-China climate and clean energy and water and pollution type cooperation and competition. And of course, since 2013, we've been doing lots of conversations about China's Belt and Road Initiative. As most of you tuning in today know that in 2013, China started the BRI, gave it that stamp of approval, and we started seeing a lot more Chinese banks and companies bringing, albeit much needed investment into infrastructure into the global south and beyond. So trains, energy, roads, you name it, it was out there. Over the past years, though, there have been increasing complaints and concerns about environmental and social impacts, a lot of these projects, the lack of transparency. And today, as part of our ongoing series that's supported by the Luce Foundation, looking at greening BRI, I've brought together a cool panel of people who are going to start to unpack some of the opportunities and obstacles for China to green the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, China has been making steps. There were new guidelines issued last year, but much work to be done. And we're going to get some great insights from today's panelists. We're going to start off with Blake Berger, who's an associate director at the Asia Society Policy Institute up in New York. He's done a lot of work over the years looking at East and Southeast Asia. And I think, correct me, in 2019, I was really lucky to be invited to be on an advisory group for their Navigating the Belt and Road project. And they put out a fabulous pub, wasn't just because of me, but I tried to help a little bit, right, Blake, with a bunch of the others. And then during COVID, we didn't get to talk much, but in that time, Blake and his colleagues, they built a kind of a new digital toolkit for stakeholders in host BRI countries, as well as international organizations that are interested in looking at how can we improve the governance of BRI. He's going to kick us off with that. And then the virtual microphone will ping over to Rebecca Ray, and she's going to jump in and do some comparison about how governments in Indonesia and the Amazon basin have kind of changed their environmental governance at times to entice more Chinese investment. And we're going to see how that went. So Rebecca is a senior academic researcher at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. And she's been doing this work very timely, Rebecca, 2013, as it all started. She started looking into how China was reshaping the global landscape on investment, and particularly focused on sustainable development issues in Latin America. In fact, she and her team are really the go-to place when you're looking at China, Latin America sustainability research, and have to admit, we at the Wilson Center, we love partnering with your team on this. The Latin America program in particular is joyous at this. After they talk, we're going to switch over. The last two speakers are going to focus more on the governance issues around China's energy investment in Africa and Asia. We're going to have Cecilia Springer, who is also at Boston University's Global Development Policy Center, and she is the Assistant Director of the Global China Initiative. And she's going to be exploring some coal study cases in Pakistan and Kenya. I have to kind of flag here that she was in our inaugural group of Wilson Center China Fellows back in 2020, so it's like, didn't get to do it live, but we still did it. And I've really been digging into her work over the year, her interdisciplinary work, looking at some of like the policy dynamics around China's attempts to decarbonize their investments in particularly Southeast Asia. Last but not least, a new person to me for the China Environment Forum, but I'm so excited to finally meet Chuyu Liu, who is a political science professor at the University of Amsterdam. Now, he's going to hone into some of the specific challenges facing China's renewable energy investment in Southeast Asia. And Chuyu, like everyone here, I mean, his research focuses on BRI. And when we first met, he was lamenting how he hadn't been able to go out on the Belt and Road and do his in-field research, but hoping that all of that is restarting from everyone here on the panel. I think what I'm going to do is going to ask, I'm flying through, but Blake, could you share your screen? And as you do that, I want to point out to people tuning in today live that you can help shape the discussion today. Underneath the live stream, there is a widget for you to put in questions, and I would really appreciate it if you put your name and affiliation, because I can't see you, and it's always nice to know who is in our little virtual room here. I also want to thank the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program, Asia Program, Brazil Institute, Latin America Program, as well as our new WABA Institute for Strategic Competition, who co-sponsored today's events. And of course, give a shout out again to the Luce Foundation, who helped support it. All right, Blake, you want to share your screen?
Sure, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join such an esteemed group this morning, and thank you to Jennifer and the Wilson Center for putting together such a great panel. So really in examining the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Southeast Asia, especially for really the past 5 years, one of the questions that we've continually asked ourselves is, what are the factors that lead to BRI projects going off track, especially in terms of social and environmental protections? So there's no denying that there are a range of contributing causes and factors, but one of the common threads throughout the projects that we've examined has been the impact of China's laissez-faire or country system approach to developing infrastructure, this rush to kickstart projects, and the lack of binding and enforceable laws and guidelines pertaining to Chinese overseas infrastructure investment. And so what this has really resulted in is a lack of fundamental due diligence being done in projects, especially during the pre-project planning stage. And what that means is that it really undercuts the sustainability of projects and the benefits that both China and the host country can really get from them. And so this approach to infrastructure, this laissez-faire or country system approach, really invokes the principles of non-interference and respect for local law, but to distance themselves from aspects of the Belt and Road that actually may fall short of international standards and best practices. And this desire to speed through critical stages of due diligence has really resulted in projects that have either stalled, failed, or if actually completed, aren't either socially, environmentally, or financially sustainable, or actually have the expected return on investment. And as Rebecca, Cecilia, and their colleagues at Boston University have highlighted, this approach that China takes, instead of actually getting host countries to uphold their own respective national laws and policies, actually incentivizes them to either water down their domestic policies or to create exemptions to both speed up and lure investors to these projects. And we actually saw this take place in Indonesia, where President Jokowi, by essentially declaring a number of Belt and Road projects as national priorities, were able to bypass the necessary foundational stages of pre-project due diligence. So it's really important here to also emphasize that it does take two to tango here, and that the issues and all the entirety of the problems resulting from the Belt and Road are really not necessarily solely Beijing or Chinese actors' faults. But prior to highlighting the digital toolkit that Jennifer mentioned that we developed to support local communities and stakeholders, and also Chinese financiers and developers, to ensure that both stakeholder engagement and environmental and social impact assessments, or ESIAs, are undertaken in a transparent, inclusive, and comprehensive manner, we found that in project after project, project developers and contractors really routinely fail to adequately address issues of fundamental importance to local communities, including land rights and labor standards, conduct transparent and really inclusive ESIAs, and effectively communicate with affected peoples and communities throughout the life cycle of the infrastructure project. And by really skipping over or speeding through this critical stage of due diligence, it deprives both the project developers and the host country government officials and communities from getting the actual direct insight into the local environment and social context. Doesn't provide them with an early warning system that would alert them to emerging challenges, doesn't provide them with the opportunity to develop and implement plans or mechanisms to address potential issues, and it doesn't provide them with an avenue for communities to flag their grievances or problems before they begin to spiral. And then lastly, without this process actually being truly inclusive and engaged, it undercuts the trust and rapport between the developers, contractors, and the communities in which these projects are being developed. And so during consultations with communities in Southeast Asia who have been directly impacted by projects, we heard a couple of illustrative examples to show just how serious these issues are. In Indonesia, for example, we spoke to communities who were impacted by the high-speed railway from Jakarta to Bandung. And one of these communities were essentially completely unaware that a tunnel was being developed in proximity to where they live. They were not involved in the SIA process, nor were ever truly informed. And so when the developers began using explosives to create the tunnel, communities were never ever explained what the risks were, what the impacts were, or what the developers would do to mitigate the damage. And so when this began, they were completely caught off guard. Their homes were damaged, no longer habitable. They lost sources of fresh running water. In Laos, we heard that communities were never really able to ever access ESIA documents. And this is especially concerning, especially since some of these projects, especially the dam projects, have actually displaced thousands of communities. And in Cambodia, we heard really the same thing, that it was communities just stressed the lack of engagement between them and the developers, and there was just a complete absence of information provided to them. And none of the community members we spoke with, or NGOs or CSOs, were ever able to really get their hands on ESIA documents. But it's really crucial to point out that the issues that we're seeing in Southeast Asia aren't unique. And actually, to the contrary, we've seen similar trends and evidence to point to similar impacts in Central and South Asia, Africa, and South America. And so turning to the toolkit that we developed, I'll just quickly share my screen here. So we developed a toolkit that provides actionable guidance to both stakeholders, local communities, and also the Chinese stakeholders involved on how to actually do critical aspects of due diligence correctly. And so users would be able to go to the website, learn how to use it, but then critically click on, for example, our step-by-step timeline, which would provide them with all the information on the actual steps involved in conducting both these projects and processes adequately, and to ensure that they're done correctly. So as an example, you could just click on one of the issue areas and see what actually goes involved, and what the roles and responsibilities of different actors are, and what international and Chinese best practices are. Additionally, the toolkit has been translated into Mandarin, Khmer, Bahasa Indonesia, and Lao, and so local communities, no matter where they are in Southeast Asia, will be able to access it. We've also created different resources that communities can use in terms of, for example, writing a letter to the Chinese embassy, or how to reach out to a Chinese industry group, and also provided them with a mapping of different stakeholders throughout the region, both Chinese, international, and also regional NGOs, banking information that they'd be able to access to be able to support them in getting better reach. So just an example, you could easily click here and find the necessary information to reach Handicap International, if that's a group that would be appropriate for you to reach. And additionally, we've mapped out all of the appropriate Chinese laws, policies, and guidelines pertaining to these two areas. And you will be able to sift through and see, either on stakeholder engagement or on environmental social impact assessments, what the actual laws are in China, what do they dictate, and where are they applicable to. And so with that, thank you so very much for having me this morning. It's been truly a pleasure, and I'll just stop ending my screen there.
That's great. I know, and I like the black look to it too. It's kind of it's a cool website, and very excited. And just to clarify, so the laws that you're posting is that you're showing like what are domestic Chinese laws, and also any regulations or laws about the BRI?
Both domestic Chinese infrastructure laws and practices, and also laws that pertain, or guidelines and policies that pertain to overseas investment. And so you would be able to see, for example, on a domestic law, that it only applies to China, or that it only applies to this specific sector. And you'd be able to differentiate between the policies, and also which policies are Belt and Road and which ones are catered to larger Chinese infrastructure and overseas development.
A lot of blood, sweat, and tears went into putting together this toolkit. Thank you, Blake. And everyone, you can continue to submit. They're already coming in already. Submit more questions about this and others. And so, Rebecca, I think that Blake has kind of laid out a good groundwork for like why the research that you and the others on the panel are doing are so important. So, if you could feel free to share your screen, and audience members, keep submitting those questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jennifer, and thank you, Blake, for a fascinating explanation of such a crucial resource right now. We've been seeing similar themes that across different regions of the Belt and Road Initiative, or China overseas in general, similar anecdotal stories and patterns are emerging of, as you said, host country governments either relaxing or creating exceptions to existing environmental and social governance in the hopes of attracting new Chinese investment. And so we ran two parallel studies looking at evidence from Indonesia and the Amazon basin and their attempts to govern and guide the China booms that they experienced. We did so in cooperation and collaboration with research partners and friends In area institutions in the Amazon basin, we worked with the Catholic University of Rio's BRICS Policy Center, and Indonesia, the Research Center on Climate Change at the University of Indonesia. And across these two studies, we asked 3 research questions. First, what common environmental and social sensitivities merit particular attention in these China booms? Second, how have national governments responded given these opportunities and these risks? And then in the Amazon basin in particular, their commodity boom really peaked about a decade ago. So because they had different commodities involved than Indonesia does. And so we have about a decade of experience after the boom to see, okay, how did Chinese investors then respond to the changing environmental and social governance in the host countries after the boom? What we found were mainly without binding governance from China, as Blake said, environmental and social risks vary widely across sectors, calling for evidence-based policymaking. And in fact, we see that from the policy perspective during booms, host countries are strengthening their protections, both environmentally and socially. But as soon as those investments begin to cool, or as soon as there's any discussion of the possibility of investment slowing down, we see a big switch towards relaxing in existing protections in order to hopefully entice more or prolong the booms. But we don't see any evidence that Chinese investors jumped to move into areas that were relaxing their standards. We don't see an economic benefit from that at all, actually, in part because Chinese investors may be seeking resources rather than trying to save a penny here or there. So let's go. I'll just highlight a few details from each case. We have more time in Q&A to get into the nuts and bolts, but just want to highlight a few of the top stories here. In Indonesia, we tracked 14 clusters of Chinese investment across the country. As you can see here, they're color-coded on the map. We've got transport projects, coal projects, hydro projects, and industrial complexes. And our spatial analysis team put together measurements of 5 different environmental risk factors and impact factors for each of these projects. We've got each of them measured here according to their impact of forest proximity, how close they are to that primary forest, the carbon density, the climate impact of any impact on those forests, vegetation loss afterwards, species density, and NO2 pollution, particularly around power plants and industrial complexes. And what we found here are, of course, there's a wide variety of impacts, as you can see, but there's commonality among those sectors, which are color coded. So hydropower, for example, in blue, we see tremendous loss of land, loss of forests, which, as you can see from the high carbon density scores, has a climate impact. Hydropower may be considered a climate-friendly investment, but if you're clearing tropical forests, there is in fact a significant climate impact to consider. There's, in the pink ones, the coal-fired power plants, there's only one. It's in operations currently, and as you can see, it has a tremendous air pollution concern to pay attention to. So this is not a condemnation of Chinese investment, but rather evidence that, in fact, policymakers can learn from these facts to create evidence-based protections for different sectors. We also tracked reports of human impacts on indigenous communities affected by these projects, 10 different communities. And as you see here, we track 3 different kinds of impacts: health from pollution, ecosystem services, meaning the loss of the natural resources that these communities use for their livelihoods, and displacement. And the sectors really almost complete unanimity in where they fell. Projects by sectors fell in the same place in this grid in their risks. So a clear call for evidence-based policymaking. And in fact, we do see that in the Indonesian environmental and social policy response at first. From 98 to about 2014, some really interesting regulatory advances happened. This is, of course, before the BRI, at the beginning of this rise in investment. Embedding polluter pays principle, requiring investors to set aside money based on the anticipated environmental impacts and cleanup costs so that they can be taken care of at the end of the project. But after investment peaks in 2017, we see a shift in the opposite direction. You may have heard of the omnibus law on job creation, which just that framing, it sets it up perfectly, this perceived dichotomy between job creation, investment, and environmental protection on the other side. And in fact, that's exactly what this law did, was relax a significant number of environmental and social protections in the hopes of expediting investment. Now it's currently suspended. It's been struck down by the Constitutional Court. It may be replaced with essentially identical legislation in another form. So we don't have evidence about what happened thereafter. But for that, we can turn to the Amazon basin case, where a similar concept, a similar story happened a few years earlier. Here we track 118 Chinese investment sites across the Amazon basin in 4 countries, Brazil, of course, as well as Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. We have greenfield investment, mergers and acquisitions, like the purchase of an oil concession, for example, and infrastructure financed by Chinese development finance institutions. And I want to focus here, we found similar environmental and social impacts and risks as in the Indonesian case, but I want to focus here on the policy story, because we've got that extended period of time since the boom peaked there to look at how did policymakers respond, and then how did investors respond? Well, our colleagues at the BRICS Policy Center in Rio have what they call an observatorio, which is essentially a library of every environmental and social regulatory change in these countries over this time period. And each one is flagged as either baseline, which are shown here in gray, strengthening, so strengthening existing regulations, protections, and red here are relaxing. And so we're just literally tracing the number of regulatory changes over time. And this black or gray dashed line here is the export price deflator. What does that mean? That essentially traces the commodity boom. Where it peaks, that's the peak of the commodity boom. That is again driven by Chinese investment and Chinese demand. And it falls very nicely into 3 categories of time. Before the boom, when this line is essentially flat, what color predominates the bars? Gray. Countries are establishing what the rules of the game are. As this line rises and you really see the commodity boom heat up, what color predominates? Blue. Countries are taking advantage of this increased demand to set protections to make sure it benefits local communities, or at least doesn't hurt them environmentally. But boy, as soon as that gray line begins to decline again, it switches entirely over to red as countries begin to pass laws with similar names to Indonesia's omnibus bill for job creation, hoping to very clearly expedite or increase future Chinese investment at the cost of environmental protection. So what happened afterwards? Did Chinese investment actually rebound? Were they able to extend the China boom? Were they able to expedite future investment? In a word, no. On the left here, we have the total size of Chinese investment over time. In light blue is when they were announced, and in dark blue is when they actually came to pass, when shovels hit the ground. There's just this one peak after the boom. Just against one project, that is the Las Bambas copper mine in Peru, which South America watchers already will know that it's currently suspended and has in fact been suspended on and off since its inception because, as Blake said about the Indonesian case, environmental and social risks were not captured in the early due diligence stage because the regulations had been relaxed. And so there have been on and off protests ever since it opened. I don't know if it's ever operated at full capacity, but if so, it would just have been a short period. This project has been the project that's launched 1,000 poli-sci dissertations about what went wrong. On the right is the average time from announcement to commencement to see, well, were these projects expedited? If they were, that number should decline over time as you go from announcement to commencement faster. But the opposite happened. If anything, things took longer because problems arose later in the process because there weren't due diligence steps earlier. So projects had to be stopped and revisited. So we don't see any economic argument here for these relaxations of environmental and social protections to prolong or entice further Chinese investment. All of this creates a pretty strong argument for evidence-based environmental and social protections, due diligence that's based on evidence for particular host countries and their concerns and priorities there. We don't see an argument or evidence that Chinese investors will seek out countries with low costs of doing business or with weak governance. We don't see that works. Instead, it seems clear that BRI host countries in general would be wise to set and keep the standards that work for them, that meet their priorities, rather than this perception of a dichotomy that environmental standards might be standing in the way of expanded BRI. So thank you so much. I'll turn it over to the next speaker and look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks so much. I really appreciate that kind of counterintuitive change there, but it also kind of supports what Blake was talking about. That projects end up getting stopped later. So it's actually not advantageous for China. So thank you. Just want to reiterate that because that's pretty cool information. Cecilia, we're gonna start switching over to the energy portion of our discussion today, which was the main focus of BRI investments for the first 6 to 7 years. So take it away. You can share your screen. And also, I'm already getting lots of questions. Keep bringing them in. There's gonna have a good discussion today. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Does this look okay?
It looks perfect.
Awesome. Yeah, so I would like to kick off the conversation about China's global energy finance through the Belt and Road Initiative and what it means, especially for governments. I'll start with some sort of bigger picture trends and statistics, and then dive into a few case studies that I think have been quite illuminating about ongoing policy processes governing China's overseas energy finance. So first, what we know from one of our databases here at Boston University that goes back to 2000 is that China's overseas development finance for the energy sector, both upstream and downstream, has declined precipitously since 2016. And that in 2021, when we released our data last year, we found that for the first time since 2000, China's development finance institutions had provided 0 new lending commitments for the energy sector overseas. So this was a 20-year low and was obviously coming at a time of ongoing debt distress as well as effects from the pandemic. So although we know that these flows of Chinese energy finance overseas have decreased, there's still a very large stock of energy infrastructure around the world that has received Chinese development finance in various stages of construction and operation. And we also know that the composition of this energy infrastructure is very skewed towards fossil fuel infrastructure upstream and downstream. So diving a little bit more into the composition, we also run a database, the China's Global Power Database, specifically tracking Chinese financed power plants around the world. And we have found that coal makes up the largest share of generating capacity that has received Chinese development finance or foreign direct investment from individual Chinese companies. And speaking of some of the regional trends, we can see that the largest share of this generating capacity is in Asia, and Asia also has the most coal-heavy portfolio. So this is especially in South and Southeast Asia. The overall numbers are pretty large. So we track about 648 power plants around the world that have received Chinese finance and investment in 92 countries. But I do think that the coal problem, so to speak, is especially an issue for the Asia region. What are the reasons behind this? Of course, there are many, many amazing field researchers out there who are going and uncovering these stories. And what we try to do from Boston University, we have kind of a bird's eye view looking across our databases. And we've tried to develop a sort of arguably simplified framework for understanding some of the factors driving why China and the host countries that it works with have been driven towards certain sources of energy over others. And as I showed you in the previous picture, coal has really been a dominant source for where Chinese finance has been going. And so specifically, talking about coal, some of the push factors, so from the Chinese side and why Chinese actors are going abroad, we see that excess coal capacity domestically has been a major factor in the past. The strategic going out policies meant to encourage Chinese companies to connect with business opportunities overseas, potentially some aspects of reducing pollution at home, also limiting opportunities for developers within China. However, pull factors are just as important, if not more important, based on host countries themselves having growing demand for electric power, Many of these countries have their own domestic coal deposits that they're seeking to find use for. Many of them have already had historical dependence on coal, and they see opportunity to work with Chinese finance and equipment suppliers that have a lot of experience with building coal plants quickly and at scale. And so I know that Chuyu will talk more specifically about renewable energy, so I won't go into all of these, but just to emphasize that there are factors on both sides from China and host countries that shape what types of energy are being financed. Now, things are changing very quickly in this space. I think probably most people here were attuned to the announcement from 2021 from Chinese leader Xi Jinping at the UN General Assembly that China would not build new coal-fired power projects abroad, and equally importantly, would step up support for developing green and low-carbon energy in developing countries. And this announcement got a lot of press attention, media attention. Everybody was talking about it. And it seemed very top down. Within just a couple of days after this announcement, there were sort of parallel announcements from various Chinese institutions, including, for example, Tsingshan, a metals company that also announced it would, not build new coal projects overseas, and also the Bank of China, of course, one of the largest banks in the country. And so this seemed to be a very top-down, high-level announcement that led to subsequent policy adoptions. But I do think there's more to the policy story. And to highlight that, I just want to share a little bit about the case of the Lamu coal plant, which has been one of the most hotly debated or protested coal plants around the world in recent years. And so local civil society groups were really working with communities to make sure that their concerns were voiced to various project developers as well as the Kenyan government. And there was a case in front of the National Environmental Management Authority, the National Environmental Management Authority. There was a case in front of the National Environmental Tribunal in 2016. Which was then won in 2019. And specifically, the judgment focused on the fact that environmental and social impact assessments for the plant had not adequately considered its pollution impacts and various other impacts. This ruling, I think, was also part of a cascade of events that led to ICBC, a Chinese bank, withdrawing from the project and the Kenyan government subsequently canceling the project. And I also just want to note the timeline. ICBC itself also issued a policy in May 2021 saying that they would establish a roadmap for gradual withdrawal of coal financing. And this was several months before Xi Jinping's announcement about not building new coal plants overseas. So I do think there was somewhat of a trickle up effect from individual cases like Lamu, as well as, of course, top-down leadership that has led to the increasing codification of China's no overseas coal policy. Lamu was a very unique case, again, because of the amount of attention that received and, sort of the organizing on the part of civil society groups. I think many civil society organizations would argue that it was a successful case in terms of their deliberations with ICBC and the subsequent cancellation of the project. However, there are still many, many Chinese financed coal plants around the world that are under construction and in operation. So what is the reality of China's current coal fleet? And I just want to share a few recent studies that we've done at Boston University that shed light on sort of the nature of China's global coal fleet and also what it means for the governance issues that we've been discussing. So I think one potential misperception about China's global coal fleet is that it's old and outdated technologies. And I think there's a good reason for suspecting this or having this perception. For example, there have been notorious cases of secondhand coal plants being picked up and moved abroad. For example, the Hunan Chongyuan coal plant, which was moved to Sihanoukville in Cambodia. And clearly this was a case of, sort of technology that couldn't cut it in China's own domestic regulatory framework just being taken abroad. However, looking at the whole of coal plants across Asia, and again, they are very concentrated in South and Southeast Asia, comparing the Chinese plants, those with ownership by Chinese companies and those without, it's clear that Chinese coal projects tend to be larger and relatively more efficient in terms of their CO2 emissions intensity, indicating some kind of technology differential between their peers. And in the research I did as a Wilson China Fellow, I also found that the same trend holds for hydropower projects. They are larger, but they do have higher power density ratios, for example. However, this absolutely does not mean that these plants have lower environmental impacts. This is just that their relative technology level may not be, for example, as outdated or terrible as some perceptions might indicate. So China's current fleet of coal plants, drawing from our data, about half of them are less than 6 years old. Well, these are very young plants, and that means that they're going to be continuing to emit carbon dioxide for decades to come. So one of the policy proposals that is increasingly on the table for other actors is the prospect of early retirement of coal plants. So the Asian Development Bank has developed a mechanism for exploring this, and the Just Energy Transition partnerships announced by Western countries in the G7 are also going to address this. So I think given the relative youth of China's overseas coal fleets, that it will be also important for China and host countries to grapple with what's going to happen over these plants' long lifetime in the future, and whether or not that's compatible with various emission scenarios that we know will need to be achieved in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. And I just want to end with a brief discussion of the air pollution impacts of China's overseas coal plants and how it connects to governance frameworks. So we also did a case study of the Port Qasim coal-fired power plant in Pakistan, which was also financed by China and is not too far outside of Karachi, a major population center in Pakistan. And what we found is that based on sort of the meteorological dynamics, that the air pollution coming from this plant could have a very, very low and almost negligible health impact based on whether or not the pollution controls at the plant are actually run. We couldn't find very transparent information from the environmental impact assessment or reporting process as to if they were required to run or if they actually were running. And so here's an instance where the impacts of a specific plant come down not just to the choice of fuel, so coal versus gas or renewables, but really the regulatory framework developed in the host country and with Chinese developers. And that's an area where we hadn't seen a lot of transparency in this specific case. Again, we're behind the desk in Boston, so I definitely welcome information from people who may have been there or have some experience on the ground. But it comes down, I think, to the policy implications of China's energy are not just about choices across fuels, but also specifically, the regulatory framework surrounding individual plants. And we need evidence-based environmental and social protections in order to really modulate those impacts. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. And just so you know that I'm getting tons of questions coming in. So thanks to the audience, reminding the audience that you can only submit one every 10 minutes. So put it all in the first one you put in. And just someone did ask, and reminding folks that yes, this webinar will be on YouTube later, and we'll have a little write-up afterwards as well. So thank you so much, Cecilia. That was exciting. And now, Chuyu, would you like to share your slides, because you were looking at a slightly, well, you overlap a little bit with Cecilia's research as well in terms of the time frame. So talking about now about the renewable energy sector.
Okay, could you see my screen?
I can see your screen perfectly. Thank you so much, and take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Jennifer, for having me here. And thanks a lot for all the three panelists for giving their fantastic, amazing presentations. So I do learn a lot. So today I'm going to talk about research based on our fieldwork conducted with a lot of interview subjects. have some knowledge about Chinese renewable energy investment in South Asia and Southeast Asia. So this study is based on basically a recently published article by me and two other researchers. One is based at University of Oxford, another is based at Johns Hopkins University. So what we do is we use a comparative approach to looking at the Chinese overseas energy investment. So what we do is we conduct interviews with a variety of actors in China, Indonesia, and Pakistan to get our information, to know what's really going on the ground. So these interview subjects, they including government officials, think tanks, journalists, researchers, and the people from the business world. Okay. So in particular, we're looking at two countries. So the first one is Indonesia. The second one is Pakistan. We choose these two countries is because these two countries are among the top 5 countries that receive the most investment from China in their power sectors. Okay, so they are quite important in terms of us to understand Chinese overseas investment in the power sector. Okay, so this study is motivated by 2 puzzles, so to say. So the first puzzle is that why do Chinese actors more likely to engage in solar and wind sectors in Pakistan rather than in Indonesia? Okay, so that's the first puzzle. The second puzzle is why are these Chinese-banked coal-fired power projects are cleaner in Pakistan compared to their counterparts in Indonesia? And for this presentation, I will give my priority to the first puzzle because Jennifer asked me to focus on the renewable energy instead of the coal-fired power plants, but I will leave the discussion on the coal-fired power plants in the Q&A part. Okay, to give you a sense in terms of the technology mix of the Chinese electricity projects in Indonesia and Pakistan and show the significant difference in terms of energy landscape between the 2 countries with regard to the Chinese investment in the power sectors. You can take a look at the picture here. So the picture on the left side shows the composition of Chinese investment in the power sector in Indonesia. Okay, so you see overwhelmingly, most of these projects try to concentrate in the coal, and very few actually in the renewable energy sectors. But that's quite different when it comes to the case of Pakistan. You found that in terms of the portfolio of the Chinese electricity investment in Pakistan is way more diverse compared to the case of Indonesia. So you do find that there are wind and solar projects in Pakistan, but it's not the case in Indonesia. So it's a puzzle for us because we know that the GDP per capita is much higher for Indonesia compared to Pakistan. And we understand that the development of the renewable energy sector tend to be highly correlated with the level of economic development, right? So it's kind of quite counterintuitive why we see such a significant difference between the 2 countries. To give you a sense in terms of the landscape with regard to these Chinese companies, electricity companies, when they talk about doing our interview, when they talk about the decision-making with regard to whether or not they want to invest or engage in the RE sector, the renewable energy sectors in Indonesia, basically the takeaway is that the Chinese investors tend to be more hesitant in terms of engage in the wind power sector in Indonesia, but they feel like they are more confident, or they feel like their investment in the solar sector tend to be more promising. Okay, so that's kind of the basic takeaway after we have these interviews with these electricity companies, and when they think about they want to engage in the RE sector. But again, the thing is that most of them have not seriously get into the RE sector in Indonesia. And the reason we argue, based on the interviews we conducted with a variety of actors in Pakistan and in Indonesia, we found that there are two kind of types of factors lead to the difference between Indonesia and Pakistan with regard to China's RE investment. As the three other panelists also mentioned, it's quite important to understand the Chinese BRI project from both the host country side and from the Chinese side. Okay, so we argue that this the same thing apply to the case of the RE investment, Chinese RE investment in Indonesia and Pakistan. So from the host country side, it's quite important to understand the strengths of the vested interest in coal, and that will have significant influence in terms of the decision-making by Chinese RE project developers. The second is from, in addition to the host country side, but the second is from the Chinese side, is whether or not the RE projects can be linked to the much broader geopolitical interests of Beijing. That's also quite important or matters a lot for whether or not Chinese actors are willing to engage in the RE sector. Okay, now I want to give you more detailed information on this. So in terms of the strengths or influence of the vested interests, so here is the picture shows the technology mix of the electricity generation in Indonesia over time, and we see a predominance impact of the coal in Indonesia, and this predominance kind of role of coal in Indonesia's electricity market have lead the strong kind of impact on the Chinese RE development in the country. The reason is that because of this strong impact of the coal in Indonesia, it's these coal-based interest group have strong influence on the policy making and the politics in Indonesia. So several major actors in Indonesia's power sectors, they do have consider the interests of the coal groups instead of the renewable energy. So for example, here we highlight one of the largest electricity company in Indonesia, which is PLN. And PLN have this monopolistic position in Indonesia's power sector. And PLN's grid network is more suitable for the coal-fired power plants compared to the RE power plants for obvious reasons. And because of that, the PLN is quite hesitant in terms of negotiate with the RE kind of project developers and connect their power to the national grid, and that makes create a lot of hurdles for the Chinese RE developers to make their decision to decide whether or not to invest in Indonesia. And also another very important actor, which I highlight here, is MEMR, which is a ministry that plays a major role in regulation of the Indonesia's energy sector. So that is the picture on the left side, shows the picture of this building for this ministry. And this ministry have very inconsistent policy with regard to the tariff, the electricity tariff for the RE sectors. And based on our interview, a lot of these Chinese companies, these Chinese investors, they become quite hesitant because of this inconsistency policy when it comes to the tariff, RE tariff in Indonesia. So they, instead of jump into the market, they adopt a wait and see strategy to when it comes to the renewable energy projects in Indonesia. And that's we just talk about all these kind of the host country side factors affect the Chinese RE project developers' decision making or their calculations. And we also argue that it's also quite important to understand whether or not Beijing is willing to support the RE projects in the host country. Okay, so that's about the Chinese side. In addition to the PERS, you need to think about both the push and pull side, right? So now we come to the Chinese side, and we found that based on our interview, when it comes to the case of Pakistan, we found that the strategic interest plays a very important role in promoting the RE investment in Pakistan. So basically, the Pakistan used to import a lot of the oil as a major source for the electricity generation in that country. As this picture shows, the technology mix of the electricity generation in Pakistan. As you can see, oil is quite important, and most of this oil comes from the other countries. So the imported oil as a major source of the electricity generation creates a problem for the foreign exchange reserves for Pakistan and lead to imbalance of the trade, and that makes these political elites in Pakistan quite worried about that. So they basically frame the development of the RE sector as a way to get rid of these energy kind of security problem, so to say, to achieve energy independence. And China, out of the Beijing strategic interests in Pakistan, decide to take the risk because Pakistan, when they first tried to find the financer to support or sponsor these RE projects, very few outsiders are willing to take the risk to sponsor these projects, but Beijing jumped in, and Beijing is basically willing to take the risk because of the strategic interest there and decide to invest money in the RE sector in Pakistan. Okay, but it's now the case based on our interview with stakeholders and actors in Indonesia. That's quite different from the case in Pakistan, which you see the top-down kind of channel in terms of the RE sector development, sponsored by the Beijing, sponsored by the Chinese actors. But when it comes to the RE development, as we just described, is mainly driven by the bottom-up, based on the calculation by the variety market actors. So it happens at the sub-state level between the project developers and these local business partners and these regulators and company in Indonesia. And because of a lot of reasons we just discussed, the co-vested interest in Indonesia, so make it harder for Chinese project developer to engage in the RE sector in Indonesia. Okay, so this brings me to the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to answer your question in the Q&A.
That was excellent to you because Cecilia talked about the push and pull, and you gave us a great case studies of how that's playing out in Pakistan and in Indonesia. And I think the Pakistan case, and I'm, maybe want to toss this out. I mean, Pakistan's it's a unique case. I mean, it's the crown jewel of BRI, and it seems to have a much more kind of integrated, engagement with the Chinese government, the Pakistani government. Not saying that all projects are successful, but I was kind of curious. Blake, can we go back to you? And when you were doing your we're open to Q&A. I've got lots of questions here, so get ready, buckle your seatbelts, folks. A lot of questions. Blake, when you were developing your toolkit, did you also look at things that were happening in Pakistan?
No, we primarily looked at what was taking place in Southeast Asia, dabbling a little bit into the case of Sri Lanka, but most of our work primarily focused on Indonesia, Cambodia, and Laos.
Well, one of the first questions that came in just as things were starting, and I know you mentioned it, but Victoria Barbary has said that I've been told that one of the real problems of BRI financing is the lack of local community consultation. And you did highlight that. And she kind of wanted to know about, is this kind of a make or break for projects? And I was wondering, can you give any more examples of you gave some negative examples. Do you have any positive examples where Chinese companies did engage with the local community, or do you only have sad ones?
No, absolutely. There are certainly examples of where Chinese companies, really did uphold international best practices, in terms of how they engage local stakeholders and communities. We've seen examples in Nepal and, certainly in other, in Southeast Asia. It's the problematic issues that rise to the forefront often in this debate. And, what we've seen is that Chinese companies are very good at what they do. They are one of the biggest procures a World Bank contract. So, Chinese contractors and developers are very good at what they do. The problem becomes is when those same companies involved in the BRI don't uphold those same standards and practices. And that's where we kind of see the issues. And so there are plenty of examples of, Chinese companies doing the exact right thing in terms of stakeholder engagement. The problem is that when it's done incorrectly, that could have a tremendous spillover effect and impact the entirety of the project.
I was wondering if anyone else here can give some examples of some good things. I remember from years ago, Friends of the Earth had done this early on, I think maybe it was even before BRI, looking at Chinese companies investing overseas, and where I think maybe it was in Peru, and also I think it was in Kenya, where the local government, the government, in the host governments had asked like the oil companies, like, please drill here. And each of these, I think it was Sinopec said, it's a national park, we can't drill there. And so that was kind of eye-opening, that the company actually, maybe they didn't even have policies, but they refused to drill in those places. I don't know. Rebecca, any stories of the positive side and like what's driving that?
Yes. So about 5 or 7 years ago, we had the pleasure of launching at the Wilson Center a book project at an event that was, I think, co-sponsored between the China Environment Forum and the Latin America program, a book project on China in Latin America. And in that project, we used case study evidence from 7 different countries where China had been a really significant player in investment booms to compare the environmental and social standards and performance of Chinese investors to their Western counterparts in the same industries. And what we found over and over and over again was Chinese investors didn't underperform their Western counterparts, but largely lived up to or down to the standards that were set for them, what the national government expected them to do. And an interesting example of that is Chinese oil investment in Ecuador. So ever since actually Western companies sold out of Ecuador because they didn't want to pay higher taxes and royalties for roads and schools, Chinese companies didn't mind contributing in that way. And so Chinese companies arrived in the form of Andes Petroleum, which is a joint venture between CNPC and Sinopec. And I looked through every report of environmental protests or environmental complaints of every oil company in that country since they arrived. And even though they're the most active in the number of gallons produced, they actually had the least number of complaints and the least number of protests, in large part because they arrived, there were immediate protests and demands from communities that specifically said, here's what we want. We want local funds, we want local contracts, we want local truckers used, etc. And the Chinese firms complied and largely have gone without as much controversy as other oil companies. We are talking about oil drilling in the Amazon, which is intrinsically fraught with environmental and social conflicts. And so that said, within this extraordinarily problematic sector, Chinese firms actually outperformed their Western counterparts because it was made clear to them what was expected of them, and they were able to comply quite simply. In other contexts where what is required of them changes, or what the national government expects of them doesn't meet what the communities have come to expect because of weakened environmental standards on paper, that's where you find problems. And that's like the Las Bambas case that I mentioned, where there was a revision in the plan. Instead of shipping minerals through a pipeline, they've now changed the plan to ship via trucks. And so we're talking about many trucks of mining products going through local communities that are and concerns about air quality from those trucks and from the dust coming off of those trucks. They were not required to go through another round of environmental and social consultations because of newly streamlined environmental and social standards. And so these communities did not have a chance to set demands or say, if this is what you're going to require of us, if we're going to have to breathe your dust, here's what we want from you. None of those traditional negotiations happened that communities had come to expect the right to participate in. And that's one of many drivers of this perpetual conflict in this particular mine, is simply a mismatch between what communities have come to expect and newly relaxed environmental and social standards on paper. And so national governments are not asking firms necessarily to live up to the standards that communities expect of them. And so I am not putting all of the onus on national governments. This is a co-governance situation like any foreign investment. But those are the trends that arose in our case study evidence from across the region. So I hope that helps give some context and balance to, are there any happy stories? Yes, there are some happy stories. And largely whether or not stories turn out to be happy involves this interplay of local stakeholders, national governments, Chinese investors being able to communicate and coordinate. And when that space is curtailed by relaxed deregulation, that's where we see less dialogue, less ability to set expectations. That's where we begin to see performance erode. Thanks.
And you kind of went through the kinds of thing that's on Blake's toolkit checklist. The communities did the things, they demanded it, the companies responded, and you had this kind of
exactly. That's why his toolkit is so cool.
That's why toolkit is so important. One thing, just before everyone gives us happy stories. I mean, we can be depressing too, but Javier Garcia, a reporter for Business News Americas from Chile, I think he's asking you, Rebecca, what sectors in Latin America should be prioritized by China for sustainable governance, like mining, infrastructure, forest, like what? I mean, because I kind of get the gist of today's conversations that there's the push and pull, but from the Chinese end, what should China be focusing on to kind of fix in Latin America?
It's great that this reporter is calling in from Chile in particular, because of course all eyes are on Chile, Bolivia, and Argentina and Mexico at the moment as they begin to develop, or in Chile's case, continue to develop their lithium reserves, which, as you mentioned, Jennifer, you have a critical minerals project coming up. And this is, of course, the sector that's on everybody's radars, and in fact is the largest sector for Chinese investment recently in South America, are on both ends of electric vehicle supply chains in the mining countries of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia and Mexico, where most of the lithium in the world is found. We see lithium investments, and in countries with significant markets in electric vehicles like Brazil and Mexico as well, we see investments in automobile manufacturing. So there is a possibility, with greater dialogue and coordination, to take advantage of the moment for this increase in Chinese demand, but also the increase in Latin America's ability to vocalize and strategize about rising up the value chain, not simply being a source of commodities, but also a market for manufactured goods and also a home for manufacturing, to be able to build up a really win-win relationship. But that's going to depend on all these kinds of coordinations that Blake was talking about. So there's promise, but there's also real concern and need for active evidence-based governance. Thanks.
Okay, great. Blake, did you have anything you wanted to jump in there on that, or you good? But we did have one quick question on your toolkit. What's been the uptake on the toolkit? Are people clicking?
Yeah, so on the good side of the equation, we're definitely getting an uptick in users, and so especially since the translated versions in Mandarin, Indonesia Bahasa, Khmer, and Lao came live towards the end of 2022. We're beginning to see much more local engagement throughout the region in terms of its utilization, which is really good news, because it's that information that could really support both sides of the equation and making sure a lot of these critical aspects are done better.
And also, Jacob Waddle, a grad student at AU, also kind of follows up with that. What are things that you're doing to actually get the toolkit into the hands of local folks? Are you going on tour? You got your T-shirt ready for all the cities you're going to go visit to introduce the toolkit?
Getting my virtual passport stamped as we speak. So what we've really tried to do is work with our NGO network and host government officials to really hold seminars and workshops with local communities on how to actually use this correctly and what is the best way to utilize it, and who you can actually speak to on within your own country and regionally in terms of different stakeholders, NGOs, CSOs that could actually support you and your community in terms of seeking redress. So so we're certainly seeing uptake, and only hope to see more and more of it as time goes on.
Good deal. And we will put that link on our website, folks, but Google will help you there. Maybe to go back to make sure I want it on our energy team here. Cecilia, are there some things that you've seen some kind of positive, engagement, or push pull that it works out well in terms of like better regulation of the coal plant or renewable energy, dams?
I would just say that I think that there actually needs to be more attention paid to the first half of Xi Jinping's announcement on coal plants, which everyone perceived as a coal plant announcement, but was really about also stepping up support for green and low carbon energy. I think there's been some indications about what green and low carbon energy means in the March 2022 multi-ministry guidance, where they named specifically wind and solar, but also other sources like hydrogen, and I think smart grid upgrades, that kind of thing. So, you know, I would say that actually in our databases, we haven't seen this step up of support forthcoming yet, but hopefully as, you know, travel starts to open up, you know, there's going to be more deals struck. And I do think we've seen from sort of the private sector, the wind and solar developers around the world have certainly continued to do business and investment in their respective sectors, weathering the pandemic.
And I guess you kind of touched on it, but I should have pointed out that Sarah Schoenhart from EE News, you know, when she said that, you know, so okay, say China stopped, you know, has China stopped investing in coal plants since the 2020 commitment to do so? And you said, at least right now, it appears to be, but she wants to get a sense of how, can you see how that's, and maybe Chu, you can jump into how that's impacting the investment portfolio. Do you think I mean, is it too soon, or are you seeing some more renewable energy investments? Or you're saying people need to look into this more?
Yeah, I would say, firstly, on the coal, we have seen no instances of violations of this announcement in any way. I mean, I think that the language is a little bit unclear. So plants that were in you know, reached certain stages of financial negotiations are likely to continue to go forward, even though arguably those would be new. Based on the very, you know, vague language in the announcement, but nevertheless, we haven't seen any new deals struck that are like clearly violating the terms of the announcement. So I do think it is, you know, developers, companies are aware of it and are not going to flout it. But yeah, I do think on the renewable energy side, I mean, maybe Becky can talk more about this, but there is discussion potentially of expanding Chinese investment into the Cauchari solar plant in Argentina. But like I said, just in our database that goes through fall of 2022, there hasn't been huge movement on the renewable energy side the way that I would think the language indicates, you know, a big step up of support, and that hasn't happened.
Okay, great. And well, I was curious that maybe Cecilia, you or Chu, you could comment. I did see some news stories in Indonesia that there has been some rumblings that maybe instead of coal-fired power, that maybe the Indonesian companies are wondering if China could invest in coal gasification, which maybe isn't, I mean, it's not a coal-fired power plant, but it's not quite in the spirit of it. Have you, either of you heard, is there any movement on this? I mean, because Indonesia is a huge coal producer. Have you heard any news on that? Chu, you or Cecilia?
I heard some rumors on this. There are a lot of discussions behind the scene. But with regard to the RE kind of project in Indonesia, I think you're right, Jennifer. There are significant changes in recent years, especially after the kind of the partnership between Indonesia and IPG. So they initiate a new program, I think called JETP as a way to initiate the energy transition in Indonesia. So now, based on what I heard, all these are rumors. A lot of these Chinese renewable energy companies they be more enthusiastic about the prospect in terms of engage in the RE sector, especially the solar sector in Indonesia now compared to the period prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, and also ever fast on his typing, Javier Grecia, the reporter from Business News America Chile, has kind of a question about the noting that aside from generation, the coal plants, et cetera, that Chinese firms have also invested in energy transmission. See the purchase of Chilean distribution CGE in 2020. Wants to kind of know about, and I want Cecilia and Chu to start with this. what are the implications for the BRI and environmental governance when we're looking at these transmission line investments? Maybe Cecilia, you want to start off?
I can start. I think that improving grid infrastructure and including transmission lines is going to be necessary to help countries integrate renewable energy into their own energy systems. But of course, these kinds of projects, especially really long distance or large transmission infrastructure, can go through protected areas and just create all kinds of risks just based on the nature of that kind of infrastructure. So I think it's like, for example, other aspects of sort of the renewable energy infrastructure that needs to come about in order to facilitate energy transition. It can be sort of a double-edged sword, if you will, in terms of the benefits it brings, but also the risks that it creates. So, these, like I said, in our China's Global Energy Finance database, that at least for development finance, this has really dropped off in recent years for things like really large projects like transition infrastructure. But that, if and when it comes back, it needs to be managed responsibly.
And it's also subject to that push and pull, like are the host countries kind of asking for this kind of infrastructure, or is it being pushed? Chuyu, do you have anything you also want to add about either the transmission line investments or just renewable energy? Any other stories you want to share that you didn't get to talk about during your presentation?
Oh, no, I'm good. I'm good right now.
You're good? Okay,
Yeah.
good. Okay, Ted Lung, who's a fellow at the Wilson Center, he said, if I were Chinese, I'd wonder if US investments would or do pass the same sort of scrutiny under similar criteria as we've been discussing today. So he gives examples of Freeport or Exxon. If not, is China wrong that BRI monitoring initiatives are a weapon in great power competition? It's his question, but he does raise the issue that, what about US investments? Or, a number of these many Chinese investment projects have international partners. Who wants to touch this one? Rebecca, go ahead.
I'll get it started. This is a fun question. Thanks for contributing it. So when we look at US investment initiatives that are attempting to take some of the high points of the BRI, like coordination, when we look at, for example, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, or the European Global Gateway Initiative, when we look at these initiatives, they haven't turned into concrete projects yet, but at the moment they're laying groundwork of a vision of high quality, sustainable, inclusive, and well-coordinated investments. And if those come to pass, that is a wonderful vision. In order to have that coordination, though, it's a very high bar to meet. And so, for example, Javier's question about power transmission projects, China's the world leader when it comes to long-distance, high-tension, very high efficiency power transmission. When China's recent wave of investment in South America's energy transition was largely driven by Western companies selling out. Before the pandemic, the regional growth slowed. Western investors sold out. They simply don't have the same kind of staying power through ups and downs that large state-owned enterprises that have, say, 5-year plans rather than quarterly profit targets may operate with. That may be advantageous to, for example, Chile's goals of drawing power from the Atacama, the second best place in the world to generate solar power outside of Tibet, down to the population centers, which are thousands of kilometers away. You need that long distance, high tension, ultra high efficiency power line technology that basically nobody else has. So if Chile wants to strategically integrate this, there's an opportunity there, but it isn't guaranteed. It's not, oh, China's going to come and they're automatically going to bring great technology and renewable energy. It remains to be seen for me whether Western efforts like PGII will be able to bring coordination and staying power, because otherwise, if they bring more, say, power transmission lines, then the next time growth declines in the region, those companies will sell out and Chinese companies will buy them. And so ultimately, there's a coordination problem at the core of all of this. And that's part of the promise of the BRI, is to have coordination at the heart of it and have countries and enterprises dialoguing about what's important for our next steps. But there's no guarantee that Western companies will stick around. There's no guarantee that Chinese will either, but history is borne out. State-owned enterprises are willing to stick around and they have the technology. So it's up to the strategy of local governments to decide how to approach that. Thanks.
And maybe I want to bounce over to you, Blake, because I mean, your toolkit, I mean, it's focused on China, but can you tell us a little bit more about, are there similar toolkits that track like US overseas investments like this?
I mean, in terms of toolkits, I don't know if there's something similar for the US, but I would just say that, monitoring the status of BRI projects or infrastructure projects in general is a good thing. It's good to have and keep tabs on what actually companies are doing. I mean, just taking the perspective of multilateral development banks, it's a reason why we've seen constant and continual evolution of international best practices and standards when it comes to infrastructure development. It's because Western firms engaged in these projects dropped the ball, did things that they were not supposed to do, and caused the MDBs to turn around and say, this is not a sustainable practice. We need to elevate our practices in order to ensure that local communities aren't being negatively affected. That's a good thing. And I also think that it should be applied to the BRI. I mean, China has taken steps even internally. MOFCOM, for example, has a BRI monitoring mechanism. That being said, it's not well staffed enough. I know Thomas Hale from Oxford has written on this in a previous paper about the need for further monitoring mechanisms, but it also ensures that projects are done correctly. And that's also a key goal of President Xi Jinping, which he announced during the last BAR, a Belt and Road Forum in 2019, was to lure and attract international investors. International investors aren't going to invest in projects that aren't being conducted to a high standard. And so having a monitoring mechanism doesn't necessarily put the Belt and Road in a bad place, but if properly done and overseen, actually really does benefit projects to ensure that not only are the locals getting the benefits, but Chinese firms are receiving a return on their investment and they're just not losing out. So that's what I would frame that as.
Yeah. And also, and for decades, I mean, we have had, international NGOs monitoring and watching US and European coal and other types of industries. And so, yes, I mean, so that, and I mean, that's the kind of model that your toolkit and other activism around the world has, correct? And looking at BRI?
Yes, I mean, and you're also seeing that in the AIIB as well. The AIIB is a full-fledged international multilateral development thing. And you see in there people focus grievance mechanisms and different other kinds of mechanisms to ensure stakeholder engagement. It's of the highest levels. And so there's a recognition that it's critical for infrastructure projects to have these things built into them in order to make sure that, they're sustainable in the long term. And so, it's not a bad thing. I think it's just something that will ultimately elevate and ensure that BRI projects going forward are just built at a higher level, at a higher standard.
Okay, great. Before I go any more questions here, I want to ask, do you guys have any questions for each other?
Well, I was fascinated by something in Chuyu's presentation, and I'd love to hear more about it, if you're interested in telling us more about it. And that is the kind of lack of coordination between Indonesia's central government and Indonesia's potential investors in renewable energies, and instead like the vested interests in sunsetting industries like coal. I'd love to hear how you see that, if you see any promise of that changing in the future. You mentioned that there were Chinese investors interested in approaching Indonesia for solar, although wind wasn't seen as quite as viable. So these are relationships that take a while to build, and coordination takes a long time to establish. I'd love to hear what you think the prospects are for the future. If you see any signs for hope in there. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Rebecca. Yeah, I do feel I'm kind of in a social media group, WeChat, with a lot of these people who have interest about the energy transition in Indonesia. So I do hear some rumors about this discussion, ongoing discussion on this issue. My sense is that I feel compared to what happens prior to the pandemic, prior to the recent significant policy change in Indonesia. So I do feel like the things get more optimistic in that sense, get more promising compared to the previous period, which the cow kind of interest group do plays a very predominant role in both the decision making and the all these policy making relevant to the RE sector. Yeah, so I now feel like things gets better. Yeah.
I also was wondering about Pakistan. I mean, after those horrific floods that it was like 2/3 of the country, and that the Pakistan government is, they acknowledge that this has to do with climate change, and we're leading the call with China at the climate talks about getting more money to developing countries. Do you think, are we going to see more of a pull by Pakistan, under the CPEC saying like, we want renewables? Have you heard any rumors of that for Pakistan, Chuyu, or anyone else here?
Actually, I do not follow up too much on what recently happened in Pakistan. But I do feel like in terms of the channel, the interaction between the Pakistan and China is way more institutionalized compared to the case in Indonesia. So if what Jennifer just described works in terms of the pressure from Pakistan side, ask Beijing to spend or invest more in the RE sector in Pakistan, I do feel like the Beijing do have much stronger incentive to do that compared to many other cases in which Beijing does not have the strategic interests. Yeah, because based on what I heard, many of these, for example, the solar park project in Pakistan, they are losing money, but Beijing is still willing to continue spend money to support these projects. So I do feel like the strategic calculation do play a significant role in Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, they have staying power, like Rebecca said. This has, I have another kind of questions. If any of you have seen, because we know that in China, I mean, we've seen a real acceleration over the past decade of China's, focusing on green energy, creating the right incentives, sometimes very, subsidies, pull subsidies, strongest survive in terms of renewable companies and others. Have any of you seen, like maybe in Latin America, where, I mean, China has some green governance at home, biodiversity rules are getting stronger. Any of those kind of conversations happening with their BRI partners, Rebecca?
Unfortunately, here we see a lack of the coordination that I keep emphasizing. Sorry to sound like a broken record here, but China's Ecological Red Line process is remarkable. The speed with which they rolled out their own biodiversity conservation domestic rules is really remarkable. And the BRI is an excellent opportunity for China to make available the technology that they use, the spatial analysis tools to establish where protected areas should be. And it's one of the findings of other research that we have, that it would be great for China and BRI host countries to use that platform to extend that technique, or at least to raise capacity of environment ministries to the point they can do that host country wise. But at least in Latin America, often we see environment ministries that are very new. They're new inventions. They're not the most powerful ministries. They're not the most well-staffed or well-equipped ministries. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why we have our data sets, and our geolocated data set in particular, to kind of assist those stakeholders in managing those projects, because their capacity is just not to the extent that China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment is at this point. So that's an area that we kind of hope that future activity will pick up, but we don't see a lot of that coordination at this point.
Blake, did you have something to add there, or anything else that you'd like to? Okay, so now I'm going to ask all of you that. So in your work, how are you engaging with China? Maybe I'll start with Blake, because you've made this toolkit, you've put it in Mandarin Chinese. How are you engaging with Chinese stakeholders for this toolkit?
I mean, in the good old days, we would have gone to Beijing and done this in person and then have gone to Shanghai. But, in the development of the toolkit, we worked with Chinese actors in, think tanks and experts and practitioners, and so using our own network within China to conduct outreach and speak to the right people, and also make outreach to the government itself to let them know that this toolkit exists, and it can be a benefit to them in terms of ensuring that things are being done the right way. And so we're just kind of still kind of undertaking this very much virtual outreach, but with the change in times, hopefully be able to get to China soon enough to be able to do it in person.
And I mean, and with what your toolkit also kind of supports those new green guidelines that came out with the BRI, and so you're working with those kind of think tanks that have helped the government produce those guidelines, right?
Not necessarily working with them, but having our work very much be aligned with the overall trend lines that we're seeing in China, that you're seeing a continual push to elevate standards and to make sure that these are actually being handled and implemented the right way. So I think it's just very much we're all working towards the same goal, albeit we're just not working very tightly together on it.
Well, things are opening up and you guys are all hitting on the road. So hopefully you can do those great presentations in Shanghai and Beijing. What about you, Cecilia, in the work that you guys do at Boston University? Are you working with Chinese counterparts on this?
Certainly. I mean, as a university, we do have partnerships with several Chinese academic institutions, including Peking University and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And I would highlight probably our collaboration with the CCICED, the China Council for International Cooperation on Environment and Development, where we've worked with them on a Green BRI special policy study for the past 4 years now. So I'm hopeful that I would go to China soon and sort of visit the many family, friends, and colleagues that I haven't seen in a long time.
Will the CCICED report come out soon? Will it be public?
Yes, they are typically released each summer around June.
Okay. Party time in June. I'm clicking on that report. How about you two? I mean, I know that you're in great WeChat groups talking to folks, but with your research, have you and your co-authors on that paper, are you, besides interviewing, are you continuing conversations with Chinese partners?
Thanks for the question, Jennifer. So I feel like in terms of conducting interview with Chinese interview subjects, it really depends on like which social group you are speaking to. So if you speak with the government officials, nowadays it becomes more and more difficult for political reasons, obviously. But it's relatively easier to speak with NGOs, the university researchers, and journalists. And I also feel like if you are able to reach out to those enterprise managers, they actually, especially the middle level managers and those who with the oversee experience, be very good in terms of the information collection. Yeah, so I really think it needs to be very strategic when it's come to conducting interview nowadays in China.
But that's good to know that there is interest, and I think that Blake had this too, that you have been able to talk to Chinese company folks too as well, right, Blake?
Yes.
That's good. And how about you, Rebecca? And because you do so much on China, Latin America, are you interacting? I mean, CCICED folks, but besides that, some kind of engagement on this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. So CCICED is, for folks who are not familiar with it, if anyone who's interested in greening the BRI should absolutely check out CCICED. It is a project that is actually based out of Canada, but partners up Chinese experts and international experts to tackle these questions together. And so we've built a host of strong relationships with Chinese researchers, not only in government agencies, but also in nonprofit agencies and at universities, looking at these projects and trying to nudge the ball forward one step at a time. And again, to answer that Wilson Fellows question, this is not a weapon of geopolitics. This is about bringing people together for coordination and pragmatic solutions to multifaceted challenges. And as Blake said, this is a process that's been done for decades. With Western investors, this is how the Equator Principles came about. With Western DFIs, development finance institutions, that's why we have the environmental and social frameworks at the development banks and the IMF performance standards. It's a crucial part of the process. And I would be a much less worthy academic if I weren't able to ground truth these efforts with stakeholders and with parallel researchers, not just in China, but also in host countries. So thanks for that question. It's such an important part of our work. But
I want to thank all of you. You're doing great work. And again, want to end it with the idea that you are engaging with China because they want to green it. And this is, you guys are kind of pointing to different kind of roadmaps. Want to thank all of you. Thank the programs that co-sponsored, and Luce Foundation. Want to highlight that in March 7th, I'm going to be doing I'm doing a co-sponsored panel with the California China Climate Initiative called Opportunities for Enhanced New Term U.S.-China Climate Action Around Food. This is part of a new project that I have going on, looking at U.S.-China, the greenhouse gas footprint of the food sector and how the two countries can come together. Go check on our website. It's 8 p.m. EST, so people in China, you don't have to stay up late. Also that's on March 7th, and on March 9th, the Wilson Center is putting on a big critical mineral panel. Go to my website or the Wilson Center General website. We're having conversations with people around the world about critical minerals and competition in that space. So again, thank all of you. You're doing great work. We're going to post your links on the website. Also, we will CCICD report. Thank you for the reminder. We will get that out. Thanks again, everyone. And also my AV team. Have a good morning, everyone. Bye-bye.